AMD today released its 9850X3D Ryzen CPU for $500. The short version of this review is that the performance of the 9850X3D is about 4% better than the 9800X3D in gaming at best, and sometimes they are completely identical. It's faster than the 7800X3D, which is now cheaper than it's been in a long time, or maybe ever in some cases, by 15 to 24%, and that's the review. Thanks for watching. 4% at best. See you later. But seriously, the price is going to matter here more than the performance at this point when the performance is that close. When it's under 10% difference, it's pretty much only price that we care about. And they are basically indistinguishable for performance in terms of actually being able to identify the difference in gameplay if you were to do a double-blind test on them. So the $500 MSRP of the 9850X3D puts it $30 over the 9800X3D on Amazon and $100 over the price of the similarly performing 7800X3D. Now, similarly here being in terms of the price for what you get, because it's still 15 to 24% advantage for the 9850X3D. On Newegg, the 9800X3D is $450 after a coupon code that applies instantly at checkout, so the 9850X3D is $50 higher than that one. The 7800X3D is $375 after an instant discount on Newegg. Now, to be fair, some of those discount codes on Newegg might be temporary, and it might have something to do with the fact that the Newegg leadership was detained by anti-corruption police in China and their stock immediately fell precipitously. But that's a different story for another time. We don't need to, look, we've been covering a lot of corruption for the last few months. I'd really just like to review a CPU. So let's just table that one for now. Let's put a pin in that. With differences this small and with the elevated price, the 9850X3D is basically an XT refresh from AMD. The XT refreshes have never done well on this channel. Previously, we called the 3800 XT a waste of sand. We also called the 3600 XT $100 for 2 letters. So 9850X3D is more similarly performing to an XT refresh than, say, a totally new CPU or something when compared to the 9800 XT that preceded it. One of the more interesting tests today, though, that we did involves using the shittiest RAM we could find on our shelves, which is a kit of DDR5-4800, and we only had 16 gigabytes of it. It was 2 sticks, though, and we threw that in the bench in addition to our normal DDR5-6000 test kit that we use, which is higher capacity, way better timings, frequency, everything else, just because it gives us a look at performance if you had to buy old, bad quality RAM, or you're reusing something from several years ago or something like that. The DDR5-4800 kit we're using, in addition to our normal test kit, is from actually when DDR5 first came out, before Crucial's abandonment of the market, which I guess makes that particular Crucial kit now a collector's item or something. But a lot of the reason for doing this is because extra CPU cache can make up a lot for poor performing memory. So X3D CPUs specifically have a unique advantage where they can get away with far worse memory specs than non-X3D CPUs while retaining most of the performance. So partly for fun and mostly as a dire reflection of our current reality of memory prices, we tested the CPU with both kits. For now though, let's get into the full review. Before that, this video is brought to you by Arctic and the Freezer 36 air cooler. We previously reviewed the Arctic Freezer 36 and were overall impressed by its mechanical build quality and design, with thermal performance also overall comparable with similar coolers on the market. The Freezer 36 performed well in our benchmarks and analysis with its dual fan solution, 4 direct contact heat pipes, and thicker fin stack centrally. Learn more at the link in the description below. This review is really simple today, which is a nice break from the hour-long documentaries we've been doing lately. So the specs on this are very straightforward. AMD's 9850X3D is an 8-core, 16-thread CPU with a maximum advertised boost of 5.6 gigahertz. It has a base clock of 4.7 gigahertz and L3 cache from 96 megabytes. It's labeled TDP as 120 watts, but this doesn't necessarily reflect true power draw. The 9800X3D is mostly the same. It's a Zen 5 8-core 16-thread part with a 4.7 gigahertz base, that's all identical, 96 megabytes of L3 cache, also identical, but its maximum advertised boost clock is 5.2 gigahertz rather than the 5.6 advertised on the 9850X3D that's brand new. Feasibly, with a good 9800X3D, you can overclock up towards that frequency. We found that 5.4 gigahertz is relatively easy to hit on our good 9800X3D parts without a lot of effort. The TDP is still listed as 120 watts for both of these CPUs. As we talked about at the release of the 9800X3D, this uses the flipped arrangement of the cache and core dies, which helps resolve some of the thermal challenges AMD previously faced with X3D parts. We ran some extensive thermal benchmarking in our original 9800X3D review that covers this, so if you'd like to learn more about that aspect specifically, you can check that review out. Today, we're mostly focusing on the 9800X3D versus 9850X3D comparisons, so if you missed the original deep dive of the 9800X3D, we have that actually in an article adaptation as well. We adapt most of our reviews into article format after we publish the videos to make it easier to go back later if you didn't know that. We also have some new games we added to the test suite for this one. In addition to the usual suspects, we've added Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 for CPU testing, which has proven to be a good workload for benchmarks. We've also added The Outer Worlds 2 for benchmarking. Both of these join our CPU benchmark games we've already had, and they are some of the newest titles in there, both from 2025. First, we'll start with frequency validation to make sure we understand the CPU's performance characteristics under different levels of load. This allows us to check that AMD is hitting its promised spec that it's advertising. This chart is for all-core frequency when averaged during Blender, rendering on all cores concurrently. We've intentionally zoomed in the y-axis of the chart to make it easier to see the spikes in the 9850 X3D. The side effect of this, of course, is that it also makes it look like they're larger than they are, but it allows us to see it better. The 9850 X3D begins its load just above 5300 MHz. Then it settles to an all-core average of around 5270 MHz. This spiky behavior indicates bouncing off of limits. In this case, those would be power-based limiters. The 9800 X3D ran at 5225 MHz dead for the entirety of the pass. The blip in the middle is from software and unrelated. That has the 9850 X3D as about 20 to 50 MHz higher at any given point for all-core averages. This means that scenarios which are more heavily core-bound will see almost no uplift. Single-thread load is next. This shows the max single-core boost at any given interval during testing. The 9850 X3D regularly hit 5615 to 5625 MHz, which is above its advertised 5600 MHz maximum boost. In our tests, AMD is continuing to slightly exceed its advertised clocks, a big and positive improvement from a few years ago when they were under them. The 9800 X3D has a maximum single-core boost of 5225 MHz sustained in this test, the same as its average all-core boost. For this reason, the 9850 X3D should mostly improve in workloads that don't fully utilize all of the cores. Games that are more frequency dependent will reflect the uplift more, whereas games that fully load all cores will mostly show identical performance between the two parts. Ultimately, based on these frequency numbers, we don't expect much change throughout the testing, but when we do see change, it'll be in scenarios that are more core limited for load. Looking back at our Blender all-core workload, this chart compares the SVI3 TFN VDDCR results for the 9850 X3D and 9800 X3D. The 9850 X3D ran at an elevated 1.231 volts as compared to the 9800 X3D's 1.18 volts for the same all-core workload. Not shown here, but measured and plotted separately, VID is showing about the same behavior. Here's the SVI3 TFN VDDCR chart for the Cinebench single-threaded workload. In this workload, the 9850 X3D's SVI3 TFN VDCR result was 1.31 to 1.32 volts. The 9800 X3D was at about 1.11 volts for the same work. The 9850 X3D is running higher voltage. Some of this could be silicon fitness, which is just luck of the draw, but some of it is definitely from pushing higher clocks. We don't typically compare CPUs and thermal benchmarks head-to-head, since that's getting more into sort of CPU cooler review territory, which we do separately. However, it makes sense here. These are two otherwise identical parts, so they can be compared directly, tested on the same board, using the same cooler, all that stuff. The 9850 X3D ran our all-core workload at a steady-state all-core T-die average of about 83 degrees. In a controlled ambient of the same temperature for each test, the 9800 X3D held 74 to 75 degrees Celsius for the same workload. The 9850 X3D is running about 7 to 9 degrees warmer under the same conditions. Both CPUs were tested using the 360mm Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 ARGB option that we have attached to this particular bench. If buying the 9850 X3D rather than the 9800 X3D, you may want to factor in a slightly more expensive or higher-end cooler if you had been considering something that might have otherwise been a borderline solution on the 9800 X3D, because borderline will push you over into needing something higher end on the 9850. This also would raise the total cost of the build, of course. We also set up the PMD for a quick power comparison in a like-for-like condition while running an all-core workload on both CPUs. We'd expect the power to be higher given the temperature results we just saw. So with the PMD interposer between the power supply and the board, measuring before VRM efficiency losses, we found the 9850 X3D pulled 164 watts down the EPS 12-volt cables. This is why we always remind people that TDP is not the same as real power. The 9800 X3D pulled 143 watts, so we're at about a 20 watt increase on the 9850 X3D as a result of its boosted voltage to maintain the higher frequency. This is in combination with the T-die increase to contribute to some of the less obvious downsides of the higher clocked 9850 X3D part, as opposed to the more obvious price, for example. Baldur's Gate 3 is up now. The 9850 X3D performs about the same as the 9800 X3D in this title, with only the 9950 X3D outpacing both of them. Both 98 class X3D CPUs are at about 165 FPS average. Also of note is the DDR5-4800 result on some of the worst memory we own, which still ties the 9800 X3D. The extra cache in this game is making up for the huge deficit in memory performance. The fall-off would be much worse on a non-X3D CPU from either AMD or Intel if dropping to a memory spec this bad, but that's kind of the trick of X3D. It can kind of make up for a worse kit of memory, which is useful right now. The performance conclusion for the 9850 X3D is the same as it was for the 9800 X3D in this game, seeing as they are the same results. 1% and 0.1% lows are also the same. The 9850 X3D and 9800 X3D both are about 24% ahead of the 7800 X3D's 133 FPS average, and about 31% ahead of the older 5800 X3D. Intel's prior generation 14900K is the closest Intel CPU to the X3D parts, trailing the 5800 X3D and just barely leading the 5700 X3D and the 5600 X3D. The 285K with DDR5 8000C38 memory has about the same performance as the 285K with our DDR5 6000 standard test kit with tighter timings. The next test is for Outer Worlds 2 at 1080p, then 1440p. This game is brand new to our test suite and hasn't been used before. It's an October 2025 release title, making it one of the newest on the bench. The 9850 X3D ran at 143 FPS average here, outpacing the 9800 X3D by 3.3%. The lows are about the same between them. The 9850 X3D is ahead of the 9800 X3D, but behind the 9850 X3D marginally. Ultimately, though, these top three are close enough that they are basically the same. You wouldn't be able to tell a difference. Running the 9850 X3D with memory that Crucial would love to sell you for $900 if they still existed, the CPU hit 132 FPS average and still leads the 14900K and 285K. That have our standard memory kit equipped 9850 X3D at 8.3% ahead of the pairing with worse memory. The 285K with fast memory hit 123 FPS average, as did the normal test. Lows are the same between them. The 7800 X3D had a 117 FPS average result, putting the 9850 X3D 22.7% ahead of the 7800 X3D, with the 9800 X3D about 19% ahead of it. The 5800 X3D trails significantly, down at 96 FPS average, and following the 9600X and 9700X CPUs. The 9000 series has benefited from better single-core performance and IPC, both enabling the superior performance here. The 5800 X3D still does well, though, with its 96 FPS average, given its age. At 1440p, the results don't change much. We're entirely CPU-bound with these settings and test processes, so even at 1440p, we remain limited by the CPU and not the GPU. As a result, we only lose a little bit of the top end of frame rate. Otherwise, things are in about the same relative spot as they were at 1080p. We'll move on to Stellaris. This is a simulation time test, not a frame rate test, and so it's one of the best possible scenarios for testing the CPU in gaming. Lower is better. The 9850 X3D completed the simulation in 29.3 seconds for this one, slightly better than the 29.8 second result of the 9850 X3D with DDR5-4800 memory. Because this benchmark is so frequency dependent, the 9850 X3D with worse memory outperforms the 9800 X3D with better memory. The 9850 X3D led the 9800 X3D with both on the same memory spec, with a time reduction for simulation of 3.9%. Just to refresh on the rest of the lineup while we're here, Intel's 14900K is the closest to AMD's X3D CPUs, but still trails by 3 seconds. The 285K is well below that, with the 285K on faster memory falling within test error and not improving. The 5800 X3D is still a great CPU, but tumbles down the ranks as compared to higher IPC and frequency modern parts. Other games that are more cache dependent keep the 5800 X3D in higher positions. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is next. This game is brand new as an addition to our CPU test suite, and we'll test it first at 1080p. The 9850 X3D is at the top again, this time at 328 FPS average with good lows behind it. Even with DDR5-4800, the 9850 X3D remains in the second spot at 325 FPS average. The better memory kit landed the 9850 X3D about 1% ahead of the DDR5-4800 one. Below that is the 9800 X3D at 316 FPS average. The 9850 X3D improved on the 9800 X3D by about 4%, which is one of the largest improvements we've seen so far. So, yay, that's exciting, or something. The 9800 X3D improved on the 7800 X3D by 17%, with the 9850 X3D improving on the 7800 X3D by 22%. Intel's 285K is below the 5800 X3D here, with the 14900K being Intel's best performer in this game. The 9850 X3D improves upon the 14900K by 34%. At 1440p, we see the top end get truncated by GPU limitations that are starting to kick in, even on the RTX 5090. The 9850 X3D's 303 FPS average is within run-to-run variance of the 300 to 301 of the 9800 X3D. Dropping memory to DDR5-4800 put the 9850 X3D slightly below the 9800 X3D with the better standard memory spec we use, but still ahead of everything else. The 14900K doesn't move here, as it's not GPU bound, and is still loading the CPU just as much as before. Dragon's Dogma 2 is up next. In this one, the 9850X3D ran at 132 FPS average, tying the 9950X3D. Both outpaced the 9800X3D by a few FPS average. The lows are the same for all of these. Technically, the 9850X3D is better than the base 9800X3D by 3.7% though, so that's something. It's just not much to write about. The lower memory speed had the 9850X3D at 125 FPS average, meaning the DDR5-6000 kit was worth about 5.5% more performance. Again, that'd be a bigger gap if it were a CPU with lower cache capacity. The 14900K sits between the 9800 series X3D parts and the 7800 X3D. The 5800 X3D isn't far behind the 7800 X3D. Testing Cyberpunk at 1080p medium, the 9850 X3D ran at 230 FPS average and was less than 1% ahead of the slower DDR5-4800 pairing. The 9950 X3D and 9800 X3D were tied and trailed both. In other words, adding 50 to the 9800 X3D is worth about 1.5% here. This chart is mostly interesting for the absolute domination of the higher cache parts from AMD. The entire top of the chart is all X3D CPUs. The only X3D part that falls down the chart is the 5500 X3D, which we reviewed separately last year, and we talked about why it loses performance like that compared to the others. Intel's closest competition is the 285K this time, including with the higher spec memory kit, although this is basically the same performance as the baseline CPU. With high settings instead in Cyberpunk, we lose some of the top-end performance due to the GPU load, but overall see the same top rank for the 9850 X3D. The 9800 X3D and lower memory spec 9850 X3D also tie here, alongside the 9950 X3D, with the 7800 X3D being the next real step down. F125 is also new to our test suite, replacing F124. The 9850 X3D topped the charts again, this time at 369 FPS average with lows paced proportionally. The DDR5-4800 result was basically the same. AMD's 9850 X3D leads its 7800 X3D by about 22% here, with the 14900K following the 7800 X3D as Intel's top performing CPU. The 285K sits below that and saw no meaningful change from the alternative memory kit we used. Against the 9800 X3D, the 9850 X3D improves by about 3.3%. It seems the average uplift is about 3 to 4% at best. In Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail benchmarking, the 9850 X3D ran at 414 FPS average, landing it just below the 9950 X3D and within error of it. The DDR5-4800 result dropped to 406 FPS average, giving the higher spec memory pairing a 2% advantage. The baseline 9800 X3D is just below that, at 404 FPS average. The 9850 X3D with like-for-like memory is 2.3% ahead as a result. The 7800 X3D is next at 360 FPS average and giving the 9850 X3D a lead of 15%. Starfield is our last game. It's been a surprisingly reliable test candidate. Can't imagine why nobody plays it. That's why people play games, because it's a reliable run-to-run variance. In this one, the 9850 X3D ran at about 200 FPS average, leading the 9800 X3D by basically run-to-run variance differences of about 2 FPS. It's not meaningful. The 9850 X3D and 9800 X3D are effectively identical in this test. The slower spec memory is also within variance. The 9850 X3D leads the 7800 X3D by 19.8% here, with the 14900K and 285K just below that. We didn't do as many production suite benchmarks as typically, since this is just a refresh of a CPU. Most of the core-dependent tests will be about the same, so you can check our 9800 X3D CPU review for that. In 7-zip compression testing, the higher core count parts are at the top. The 9850 X3D leads, followed by the 9950X, then the Intel 285K with faster memory, the 14900K, and the 285K. We eventually hit the 9850 X3D just below the 14600K and the 265K at 128,000 MIPS. Its core count is showing here. The 9850 X3D leads the 9800 X3D by 3.4% of this, about the same as we saw in gaming. The 7800 X3D is at 110,000 MIPS, so the 9850 X3D compresses 16.6% better than the 7800 X3D in this test. In decompression, the extra cache on the 9950 X3D doesn't really help it. The 14900K is behind AMD's 16-core parts, eventually with the 9850 X3D at 152,000 MIPS. The improvement over the 9800 X3D drops to about 3% from the prior 3.4%, so the frequency has less of an impact in this test than the compression test. In Blender rendering, which runs tile-based rendering for each thread, the 16-core parts predictably performed the best. Frequency doesn't have as much of an impact here. The 9850 X3D required 11.2 minutes to complete the render, effectively tying with the 9800 X3D. Moving to the 265K and up has a massive reduction in time required, so as we've seen in the past, the 8-core gaming X3D parts have disadvantages in more core-intensive production workloads. In the Puget suite with Photoshop, the 9850 X3D ends up as the top performer, although it's basically tied with the 9800 X3D. The higher frequency helps boost it ahead in a situation AMD was already leading. We had trouble getting the 14900K to complete this one, so it's absent. It wasn't immediately clear to us whether that's because it's rusting from the inside or because Adobe sucks. Both are equally plausible. So the 9850X3D is basically an XT refresh. It is slightly better sometimes than the 9800X3D in more thread-bound scenarios where you're using more of the threads on the CPU. They're going to be closer together because the clocks and all core loads are closer together. In workloads where it is more single-threaded or limited thread count utilization, the 9850X3D will boost a little bit ahead. In some of the more common good case scenarios, it was a 4% lead over the 9800X3D. Not that exciting. With the 7800X3D, the price is wildly different at this point, especially if you're buying on Newegg, at least during their executive leadership detained by anti-corruption authorities fire sale that they're doing. I don't know if that's like an every year thing. Hopefully not. Anyway, look, I got to stick to my promise. We'll save that for another time. All right, let's focus, Steve. Focus. So the 9850X3D is slightly more expensive than the 9800X3D. It's a lot more expensive than the similar 7800X3D with a $125 price advantage for the 7800X3D on Newegg now. Tough to justify the performance uplift of the 9850X3D, but at least the 98 and 9850 are double-digit percentage points better than the 7800X3D, which is more interesting at least than the 9850 versus the 9800. As we just ran through in the charts, the 9850X3D is anywhere from 0 to 4% better than the 9800X3D on average. Gaming performance is technically measurably different in several scenarios, but that doesn't necessarily mean you'll actually be able to see it or notice that change. It was interesting though to see that the DDR5-4800 kit didn't damage performance as much as you might expect. If we were to pair it with a non-X3D CPU, that'd be a different story. The voltage is a little bit higher on the 9850X3D, which is helping it hit those higher clocks we saw in both of the tests, but single core especially when doing frequency validation. Similar to how the Super Series GPUs keep NVIDIA GPU prices elevated by resetting the timer on the time available on the market, the 9850X3D will help push the ASP or the average selling price back up in favor of AMD for its top-end gaming CPU. These CPUs are effectively, at best, binned variations of the 9800X3D and support better stock clocks, so there is a real change. It's just not something you should spend a lot of money on. Also, technically, you could do a lot of this OC yourself for free. It's not that exciting. MSRP is lower than what rumors indicated, which is good, but it's still higher than the currently available predecessors from AMD. Those include the 9800X3D at $20 to $50 cheaper than the 9850X3D, and the 7800X3D at up to $125 cheaper, or $100 in some other cases. If anything, this review has brought our attention back to the 7800X3D as a sub $400 part that is very competitive. If you can break into a memory fabrication plant and steal 32 gigabytes of memory. If you can't do that, then I don't know, I guess fuck you or something. That seems to be kind of the message we're getting from the memory manufacturers right about now. Overall, this CPU is not exciting. It might be worth considering for the possibility of having a better overclocking chip in a competitive sense, though that's not guaranteed, but we don't think it's worth spending extra money on something that is this marginal of an uplift. That's especially true if you'd be willing to buy a 7800X3D instead and maybe skip the 9000 generation and whatever your next upgrade is in AM5, maybe you catch the last train in the station for AM5 and upgrade at that point from the 7800X3D. But against the 9800X3D, ignoring the 78 for a second, there's just not much reason to get the 9850X3D for an extra $50. Sometimes it's $30. Still, it's just not enough of an uplift, with the exception of maybe in some types of competitive overclocking type scenarios. But again, a better bin chip for the stock frequencies does not necessarily mean better performance under, say, liquid nitrogen. So given all of that, basically we're saying this is not worth the money right now. There are cheaper options to get, and sadly, you know, like one of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately is if you were to go for, say, a 7800X3D where you might normally get a 9800X3D, one of the reasons for that could be because $125 cheaper puts a pretty decent dent in the price of the memory. And by pretty decent dent, I mean now instead of paying 4 times more than you would have 3 to 4 months ago, you'll only be paying 3 times more. So look, it's not that good of a dent. It's just like, it's like the type of dent that you probably don't even call into insurance when it happens. So I don't know. I'm not really sure if that helps, but I'm trying to find something, all right? Give me anything. Because at this point, given that a lot of the coverage of this industry over the last 3 months has been related to its absolute total corruption at basically any level, from just the normal corporate type of corruption to now corporate plus government collaborative, we think, corruption in our opinions for all of this, involving effectively bribes to the government with things like what Micron's been doing in the White House ballroom and all the stuff we've been covering. A boring CPU doesn't seem as bad as global surveillance or deliberately fucking over the consumers. It's like, they were like, hey, is it exciting? No. Is it spying on you? Yet to be determined, but probably no, which is a good step, I guess. I don't know. In the very least, it's better than the bootlicking behavior of AMD and Lisa Su when they invited the federal government on stage at the Consumer Electronics Show to have an abrupt policy meeting about stripping away states' rights to regulate data centers and AI. So in that sense, we'll take a CPU that's meh, not really worth it, over memory cartels and all this other bullshit. That's it for this one. You're welcome for the simple CPU review. I had fun. Thanks for watching. I hope it was useful or something. You can subscribe for more as always. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly for things like this and to help me keep my sanity. Not guaranteed, but, you know, we could try. Or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out there as well. And check back for more as always. We have some more special reports coming up, and we'll see you all next time.